I thought I knew exactly who I was marrying. Then, 3 weeks before my wedding, I opened a message that made my entire relationship feel like a lie. It was from Rachel's phone, but the name on the screen wasn't mine. It said, "I still love you," and the sender was my own brother.
My name is Tyler, and until that moment, I thought I had the kind of life people secretly wished for. I was 29, working a job I loved, living in a quiet apartment, and engaged to Rachel, the woman I had been with for almost 4 years. Everything felt stable. Maybe that was the problem.
Rachel and I met at a friend's birthday party. She spilled her drink on my shirt, laughed until she cried, and somehow convinced me it was my fault. I remember driving home that night thinking about her smile. 6 months later, we had our own place, a dog, and a future we talked about like it was already guaranteed. For the first 3 years, Rachel made ordinary days feel special. We cooked together, watched terrible reality shows, and took weekend drives with no destination. She knew exactly how I took my coffee. I knew when she needed silence instead of advice. I honestly believed love was supposed to feel exactly like that. Comfortable, safe, and completely understood.
My older brother Ethan was different from me. He was quieter, more private, and the kind of person who disappeared for weeks when life became complicated. We had always been close, though. Rachel seemed to like him too, but only in the normal way. At least that's what I told myself whenever I noticed them talking alone.
The first red flag happened at my birthday dinner. Rachel was sitting beside me when Ethan walked in late. She looked up, froze for half a second, then smiled. It was quick, almost invisible, but I noticed. Later, when I asked why she seemed surprised, she shrugged and said, "I just didn't know he was coming." I let it go because Ethan had always been unpredictable. A few weeks later, Rachel started guarding her phone. She never used to care if I picked it up to check a restaurant reservation or change the music. Suddenly, she carried it everywhere. Even when she showered, the phone came with her. I noticed, but I stayed quiet. Then she started receiving messages late at night. Whenever I entered the room, she turned the screen face down. One night I asked, "Who keeps texting you?" She smiled too quickly and said, "Work." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her, because the alternative meant admitting something was already wrong.
The strangest part was Ethan's behavior. He stopped coming over when Rachel was home. If I invited him for dinner, he suddenly had plans. If Rachel mentioned him, Ethan changed the subject. I remember asking him directly, "Did I do something?" He looked at me for a long moment and said, "No, Tyler, you didn't."
That answer bothered me more than anything else. You didn't. Not, "No, everything's fine." Not, "Why would you ask that?" Just those 3 words. I went home that night and watched Rachel sleeping beside me. I wanted to wake her up and demand the truth, but fear held me back. Sometimes ignorance feels safer than confirmation. A month before the wedding, Rachel told me she needed to visit her mother for the weekend. I helped pack her bag, kissed her goodbye, and watched her drive away. Later that evening, Ethan called me unexpectedly. He sounded nervous. "Hey," he said, "can we talk about something?"
I asked him what was wrong. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Forget it. It's nothing." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Before hanging up, he said, "Tyler, if you ever find something out, don't assume you know the whole story." Then he ended the call.
I barely slept that night. His words kept replaying in my head. The next morning, Rachel came home smiling, carrying flowers she said her mother had given her. I hugged her, but something inside me had changed. For the first time, I wasn't looking at my future wife. I was looking at someone I was afraid I didn't know. 3 days later, I found an unfamiliar receipt in her car.
It was from a hotel nearly 2 hours away. The date was the same weekend Rachel had supposedly visited her mother. My hands started shaking. I checked the address twice, hoping I had misunderstood. I hadn't. When Rachel came home, I asked where she had stayed.
She answered immediately. My mom's. No hesitation. I placed the receipt on the table. Her face changed, not dramatically, just enough. She stared at it, then looked at me and whispered, "Tyler, please don't make this bigger than it is." That sentence hurt more than if she had simply admitted everything.
I asked her who she was with. She said nobody. I asked why she had lied. She started crying. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't move. Then she said something I will never forget. "There are things I'm not ready to tell you." That was the moment I realized the truth was bigger than a hotel receipt.
That night I called Ethan. He didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. Finally, around midnight, he texted me. "I'm sorry." Just 2 words. I stared at the screen until my stomach dropped. I suddenly remembered every strange look, every canceled dinner, every secretive message. My mind connected pieces I desperately wanted to keep separate. The next morning, I checked our shared bank account. There was a withdrawal from the weekend Rachel had traveled. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. The location was near that same hotel. I sat in my car outside work for almost an hour, staring at the steering wheel, unable to breathe normally. I didn't go to work. Instead, I drove to Ethan's apartment. He opened the door and looked at me like he had been expecting me. I asked one question. "Is it Rachel?" His face collapsed. He stepped aside without saying anything. That silence answered me before his words ever could. Ethan sat across from me, his hands shaking. "It started before you two got serious," he said. I stared at him. "What started?" He looked down. "Rachel and me." My ears started ringing. I actually laughed because the truth sounded too ridiculous to be real. My brother and my fiancée. Secretly together. He told me they had met before Rachel and I became official. It had been brief at first, but feelings developed. Then Rachel chose me. Or at least, that was what Ethan believed. Months later, she contacted him again. One message became another. Then phone calls. Then meetings. Their secret relationship had continued for years. I asked Ethan why he never told me. He looked directly at me and said, "Because every time I tried, she told me she would stop." I felt something inside me crack. "And you believed her?" I asked. He swallowed hard. "I loved her, Tyler. That was my excuse. It wasn't a good one." Then came the part one never expected. Ethan told me Rachel had tried to end things several times. But every time she came back, she would tell him she loved me and loved him differently. I couldn't understand that. I still can't. How can someone look into your eyes every morning and live another life behind your back? I drove home and found Rachel sitting on the floor of our living room. She knew. Maybe Ethan had called her. Maybe she saw my car. I didn't care. I placed my keys on the table and said, "Tell me everything. No more protecting me. No more excuses. I want the truth." Rachel cried for almost 10 minutes before she spoke. She admitted the hotel wasn't the first time. There had been dozens of meetings, hundreds of messages, and years of lies. But then she said, "Tyler, I never wanted to hurt you." I looked at her and answered, "You didn't accidentally hurt me. You planned it." She told me she had planned to confess after the wedding. I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. "After the wedding?" I asked. She nodded through her tears. She said she thought marriage would finally force her to choose. That sentence destroyed whatever sympathy I had left. She wasn't confused. She was postponing consequences. Then she revealed something that made everything even worse. Ethan had recently told her he was done. He had finally refused to continue being her secret. That was why she had become distant. That was why she was anxious. The person she had been cheating with had walked away, and I had mistaken her sadness for guilt. I asked her if she still loved Ethan. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough. I walked into the bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out the wedding suit I had carefully chosen. I stared at it for a long time. A week earlier, I had imagined wearing it while promising her forever. Instead, I put the suit back and started packing a suitcase. Rachel followed me, crying, "Please, Tyler, don't leave like this." I stopped and looked at her. "How else am I supposed to leave?" She reached for my hand. I pulled away. For the first time in 4 years, touching her felt like touching a stranger. I stayed at a hotel that night. I turned off my phone, but the messages kept coming when I turned it back on. Rachel apologized. Ethan apologized. My mother called. Friends asked what happened. Nobody knew the whole story yet. I didn't want to explain it. How do you explain that your brother and your future wife chose each other behind your back? The next morning, I canceled the wedding. Calling the venue was strangely easy. Canceling the photographer was harder. Telling my parents was almost impossible. But the hardest call was to Ethan. He answered after one ring. I said, "I don't hate you." He started crying. Then I added, "But I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Weeks passed. Rachel moved out. Ethan left town for a while. I stayed in the apartment we had shared, surrounded by memories that suddenly felt borrowed. Eventually, I learned something important. Heartbreak doesn't always arrive as one dramatic moment. Sometimes it arrives quietly, every time you remember another lie you once believed. Months later, Ethan came back. He asked to meet me. I almost said no, but I agreed. We sat at the same diner where our father used to take us as kids. He apologized again. This time, I believed he meant it. Forgiveness didn't come instantly. It wasn't a clean ending. But I realized I didn't want anger controlling my life. Rachel also sent me one final letter. She said she regretted everything and wished she could go back. I read it once and put it away. I didn't respond. Not because I hated her, but because I finally understood that closure doesn't always come from another person. Sometimes closure is deciding you no longer need their explanation. A year later, I was dating someone new. She didn't know every detail at first, and I didn't tell her immediately. But when I finally did, she listened without judging me. She asked one simple question. "Do you trust yourself again?" I had never considered that. Then I realized I did. That was the real victory. I used to think betrayal was about losing another person. Now I know it can also mean losing the version of yourself who believed everything was safe. Rachel secretly dated my brother, and for a while, that secret destroyed me. But it also taught me something I needed to learn. Love without honesty is not love you can build a life on. If this story made you question what you would do in my place, remember that sometimes the hardest decision is also the healthiest one. I could have stayed, demanded answers forever, and let their choices define me. Instead, I walked away. And eventually, I stopped asking why they betrayed me and started asking what I wanted next. Because sometimes the person you thought was your forever becomes the reason you finally choose yourself. And sometimes the truth arrives at the worst possible moment only because it is giving you one last chance to escape a life built on lies. If you were Tyler, would you ever forgive Rachel, or would you walk away for good?